Hi, everyone. My name is Susan, and I recently completed my PhD at the University of Alberta, and I'm also work as the Director of Policy Analysis for the Alberta Federation of Labour. And so I want to do a presentation today on what's happening in Alberta. It's quite exhausting, so I'll get started. So just some context in case people are not familiar. Alberta is historically a province that is dependent on revenue from oil and gas. So it's resource revenue, and that tends to go up and down, as I'm sure you know, in the world. And we're also a province that has historically voted for conservative governments for decades at a time. The one exemption kind of to that trend is we recently had an NDP government, so more progressive government, in 2015, and they were replaced by what we now have as a United Conservative Party. And so this party is an amalgamation of two separate conservative parties that we used to have, the Progressive Conservatives and a party called the Wild Rose. And we basically had Jason Kenney, who was in the federal politics at the conservative level. He came back to Alberta when the federal conservatives lost power. And he became the president. He became the leader of the Conservative Party, and then he helped negotiate the merger between the Conservative Party and the Wild Rose in order to make the UCP. And then he ran for leadership of the UCP. So far, that leadership campaign has collected over $200,000 in fines from the election commissioner. But it's okay because the UCP got rid of the election commissioner with their legislation. And it is currently being investigated by the RCMP for a bunch of things that happened during it. So we're having a great time from the start. And then we're getting into kind of some of the stuff that's been happening around COVID. So I wanted to use a kind of disaster capitalism as a way of looking at what's happening, just because the sheer amount of change, the sheer amount of legislative agenda that's getting pushed in Alberta right now is overwhelming, and it's very disorienting. And so it is reminiscent of Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism, in that it is kind of this orchestrated raid on the public services. And we're kind of seeing attacks during these catastrophic events and a treatment of these disasters as marketing opportunities. And so in Alberta, what we're seeing is we basically have two crises that are happening at the same time. We've had this state of crisis that has been happening for years now, which is recession caused from drop in the price of the worldwide drop in price of oil. And now we have in combination COVID-19. And so it's really looking at the UCP and how they've been able to push a neoliberal agenda, a privatization, less regulation, and selling off public goods and services, and just how they've been able to do that in combination with these two crises that are happening at the same time. And so I'm just going to go into a bit of a timeline. I'm not going to cover, not going to cover all the legislative changes just because we don't have enough time. And these are just some of the highlights from the first couple of sessions. And so some of the changes from 2019, one of the first changes they did was tax cuts for corporations. So they took Alberta from having a 12% tax for corporations to, they're moving it to an 8%. One of the things they actually did is in the middle of the COVID crisis, they accelerated dropping that. And the whole means that it's going to make jobs for people. We haven't yet seen the jobs happen. One of the other bills that I wanted to highlight that's not directly about labor legislation is from 2020, which is Bill 1, Critical Infrastructure Protection Defense Act. And so for this one, they basically took the idea of critical infrastructure and they encompassed almost every public space that you can imagine as critical infrastructure. So it includes roads, sidewalks, the area beside roads, public squares, anything like that. And they made a daily fine of $1,000 that if anybody impedes the activity that would normally take place in that public space, they could be fined every day. And then if you can't pay that fine, you will have to go to jail. So we've seen a lot of changes like that. Some of the other things are just privatization options for our education system. They've opened it up by creating more opportunities for charter schools, which are entirely publicly funded, but they're privately run. We've seen during COVID just an increase in enrollment in the private schools in Alberta. I'm not sure if other provinces have seen that. They've also gotten rid of our pilot program for childcare, which capped our childcare fees at $25 a day. They've also gotten rid of accreditation standards for our childcare system. They're currently reviewing a criteria for a program we call AISH, which provides funding for people who are severely disabled and are unable to work in the province. They've also implemented different policies, legislations that allow them to circumvent democratic debate. So even changing some of just the customary things that we had about how political parties could invite guests to committees to testify. They've gotten rid of some of that. Just trying to limit debate as much as they possibly can. They've actually gone ahead with delisting some of the provincial parks that we have. And then the implication here is that they will then sell that land off to be privately operated or just sell it off entirely. They're claiming they're not selling parks, but they're leaving out the part that they're delisting the land first. So therefore they're not technically selling parks. They're just selling land that used to be a park. We're seeing a bunch of other things where there's media reports of things being leaked that they're in negotiations with private surgical facilities to take public money and provide private service on a much larger scale than what we've seen before. And they're also, of course, we have a lovely thing called the Fair Deal Panel, and they're looking into ways for Alberta to sever ties with Canada in a couple different ways. So right now we have an RCMP police force that does our jurisdiction for provinces outside of major city centers. So they're looking at creating their own Alberta police force. They're also looking at creating their own Alberta pension plan that will replace CPP. They've made other moves as well, which are interesting. So they, for arm's length agencies and boards where they would appoint members to be at the top, they've cut off people that had their terms before they ended and did mass appointments. There was actually a time in 2019 where they were sending out press releases within 5 minutes of each other, just announcing that people were being replaced on various boards, agencies, and organizations related to government. And this is really a great step for them in that it allows them to implement any agenda that they want from the top down in certain organizations where they may get resistance. And we're certainly seeing this in the post-secondary institutions that have also had a lot of different funding cuts coming from the UCP. So I wanted to kind of lay this out as the context that this is what's happening mainly before COVID struck. And so we're seeing a lot of different changes. It's very overwhelming. It's exhausting to try to respond to all of these. And so now I'm going to go in on just some of the labor legislation that we've seen. So some of the workplace changes in 2019 alone, we saw changes with our employment standards. We now have a youth minimum wage, which is $2 lower than our regular minimum wage. We've seen changes with holiday pay, so who's eligible to get it, how it's calculated. We've also seen a consolidation of our public sector pensions, and that the government kind of put them all together. And they made changes about workers who are public sector workers who currently have a pension. If their work is privatized and outsourced, then there's different rules along how long they'll actually have their pension, which is basically they won't have a pension. And then the other thing that we saw was with farm workers. They rolled back a lot of legislation. One of the things that the UCP ran on when they were running in 2019 was that they were going to roll back everything that the NDP previously did. And what we've seen is they've actually taken this as a chance not just to go back before the NDP, but to go even further than that. So in terms of farm workers, a lot of exemptions from occupational health and safety, but they've also opened up the workers' compensation system to private insurance. So an employer in the farming sector can actually opt out of WCB coverage and choose to take a private provider. This causes a lot of issues in terms of injury counts and how we can actually study an entire industry, and also for workers to appeal if their claims are denied. And then we have the 2020. So I'm going to look at one of the bills that actually came in that was very large, which was Bill 32. And I'm just going to look at employment standards and then the labor legislation. And I don't have enough time to go through all of these things. And this isn't even the entire changes that were listed, but I did want to highlight a couple. So Alberta now, it's the joyous division that has averaging arrangements. So what this means is an employer can unilaterally put an averaging on workers' hours to preclude, so that they will never have to pay overtime. So employers are allowed to take hours and average them out over 52 weeks. So they'll able to take it out and average it over a year, which could mean working for, especially for seasonal workers, they could be working 12-hour days and never see any overtime because it'll be averaged over a year, even though they wouldn't actually be working in their off season. We're expecting to see the same with part-time workers who may have to work very intensive shifts, and then we'll see absolutely no pay differences if they were working no overtime whatsoever. And one of the other areas I wanted to highlight was in variances and exemptions. So an employer now, a single employer or an industry or an employer association can go to our government and ask for an exemption to any of our employment standards code. There's no criteria anymore for what would be granted, if it would be granted or whatnot, or what an employer would have to do in order to get something granted. They just simply have to ask for it. And we also now have no expiration for any of these variances and exemptions, where prior to this, we would have a 2-year expiration. So it would have to be automatically reviewed in order to continue past 2 years. Now we're in a position where government will have to be proactive in reviewing it if they do that. And we're anticipating that they will not be. And then if anyone has any questions about any of these, we can do it during the Q&A. Some of the labor code changes that I wanted to highlight, and I'll highlight the union dues opt-in. And so in Alberta, we're seeing the first step towards right to work legislation. So the UCP has taken union dues and divided them out according to the activities that they would go towards. On one hand, they put all the traditional things that you might think of a union doing, so representation, collective bargaining, and they've made the dues that go towards that activity mandatory. But then they've taken this other category that they've created called political activities and other causes, and they've made those dues optional for workers. And so it's really dividing out of what unions are allowed to do and what they're allowed to do with the dues money that they collect and how they're allowed to operate as democratic institutions. And so included within political activities and social causes is any social cause, charity, any non-governmental organization or organizations or groups that are affiliated with political parties, and any other activities that they will include in forthcoming regulations, which we have not seen yet and we're currently waiting on. They also did make a change to picketing that I just want to cover. We're now obstructing or impeding a person who wishes to cross a picket line from crossing a picket line is a wrongful act, even if it's a second long. And technically, according to our legislation, your pickets cannot contain any wrongful acts, otherwise they become illegal activity. So we're seeing some really big shifts there. And we have more to come. So during the middle of the pandemic, our government decided to review our OH&S and our WCB legislation. They were consulting on certain things, such as limiting the right to refuse unsafe work, also creating a different threshold for psychological injury compensation with our workers' compensation. And so just because I'm coming to an end, I'm going to go through some of this a little bit more quickly. But taken as a whole, it seems like the UCP agenda is really kind of meant to shock the population in Alberta. And the Alberta population already seemed to be ready to accept a drastic change based on their voting pattern and the rhetoric that was going around along the election. But it'll be interesting how it's in combination with COVID, because COVID has kind of offered an opportunity for different market solutions to issues that the UCP has identified, but it's also prevented them from implementing all of their change initiatives. So for instance, just yesterday, they announced 11,000 cuts for healthcare workers, including lab staff and housekeeping and linen services. So it'll be interesting if they get any traction with that or pushback from the Alberta population, given that this was their agenda to begin with, but COVID may have gotten in the way. So I'll end with that, and just that they are also having their AGM this weekend, where they are debating right to work legislation and full 2-tier healthcare. So that's what's going on in Alberta. Thank you.